Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Let me just check. Can you hear me right at the back there? Give me a little wave if you can hear me okay. Yeah, okay, wonderful. Well, welcome to Shakespeare and Company, and thank you for turning out in such great numbers on this beautiful, sunny Parisian day. I came to Rebecca Solnit's work by chance sometime around 2001, when the subtitle to her book, Wanderlust, A History of Walking, caught my eye in a bookstore. I don't know what I was expecting, given the potential vastness of the subject matter, but I can say for certain that I wasn't expecting what I found. Wanderlust is an extraordinary book that defied categorization. An erudite and rigorous work of cultural history, a blazingly original memoir, and a compassionate, engaged call to arms, both for our right to roam in general, whether through our cities or across the landscape, and more specifically the right of women to do so unthreatened and unobstructed. In the years that followed, with books like Hope in the Dark, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, The Faraway Nearby, and River of Shadows, for which Rebecca Solnit received a Guggenheim, the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism, and the Lannan Literary Award, her work has not only educated and informed, but succeeded in what is perhaps the fundamental ambition of all literature, making this particular reader see the world through different and more empathetic eyes. And looking at the amount of you here tonight, I can say with some confidence I'm probably not alone in that. Whether writing on feminism, Western and Indigenous history, popular power, social change, or political insurrection, or whether delving into the psychogeography of New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans in her trilogy of atlases, in recent years, Rebecca Solnit's writing has found its way to ever-increasing numbers of readers, and it couldn't have done so at a more apposite and important moment. Essays such as Men Explain Things to Me, A Short History of Silence, and 80 Books No Women Should read, and now considered modern classics, have been read and shared by thousands and have been the inspiration for numerous campaigns and grassroots movements. No wonder then that the New York Times described Rebecca Solnit as the voice of the resistance. Reviewing Rebecca Solnit's most recent collection, The Mother of All Questions, the author and political activist Barbara Ehrenreich wrote, "There's a new feminist revolution, open to people of all genders, brewing right now, and Rebecca Solnit is one of its most powerful, not to mention beguiling voices." Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Solnit to Shakespeare and Company.
Wow, thank you so much for coming. This is an amazing full circle moment for me. As Adam has heard a few times from me, I ran off to Paris when I was 17 and suddenly became financially independent. And so I was a kind of starving teenage expatriate, and I haunted this bookstore. It was so important. You know, my biological life had begun 17 years before, but the life that I made really began in Paris, and this bookstore was so much part of it. So it was a beautiful thing when I ran into Adam in the bookstore when I came here to cover the climate conference for Harper's Magazine, and he invited me to come, and I gladly accepted because I'd promised to take my great niece here to France, which was her dream, and we're here on her kind of victory tour after her high school graduation. So, and it's also wonderful because like libraries and bookstores are places of such generosity, this sense of the radicalness of true cultural memory, of true interchange and true connection. And so it's always wonderful to be in a great bookstore, a great library, and this is certainly one of the world's greats. So that's the really positive part of what I wanted to say before I was going to before I read. The rest of it is, how many of you here are Americans? You can join me in what I'm calling my apology tour because, you know, I tried really hard to stop Trump. I continue to try really hard to stop Trump. Every week is more outrageous and lurid and horrific than the one before. Today, the Supreme Court made two obscene decisions, one about women's reproductive rights, written by Clarence Thomas, the sexual harasser, to give it a special sting. And you remember the man that Anita Hill outed as a sexual harasser when he was being considered for the Supreme Court in 1991, and giving the nation and the world a kind of crash course in the reality of workplace sexual harassment and why it matters. He got nominated anyway, but he's done very little since. I like to think she struck him dumb overall. But the major decision upheld the president's ban on Muslims entering the country, which is grotesque, obscene, racist, and horrific. And I know that there's plenty of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe as well, but it does feel peculiar to kind of come and be a public figure in another country on a day when my own country is so shameful. All I can say is that it's also generated extraordinary resistance. Gloria Steinem, the great feminist, said that the 60s were not like this. There were not so many people engaged. There is extraordinary engagement. Had I not promised my niece to take her, I would have canceled this tour and gotten arrested today at an immigration facility. There is extraordinary stuff going on, and the tide may turn, and the long-term future of the United States may be demographic. 50% of the people under 18 in the United States are not white, and they will not support a political party of white grievance and this xenophobia and this demonization of the most vulnerable. So I think this sometimes at my most hopeful, that this is the death throes of a dying kind of white supremacy, white patriarchy, but it will destroy as much as it can before it goes, and we will protect as much as we can as we usher it out. And I wanted to say that because how could I not? But I was going to read a little bit from Wanderlust. And this first one of the chapters is about Paris, which is really the city that taught me about walking. And in the book about walking, when I was first encouraged to think more deeply about walking, mostly what we hear about is wholesome nature walks as in the subject of walking, or what we did 20 years ago when I wrote this book. But to think about walking as a political act in terms of gender politics, as how gay men cruise, as acts of self-expression, as labor strikes, as well as environmental demonstration, and nature walks themselves can be very political. Walking really came to life as a subject for me with this book, but as an experience with this wonderful time I spent in Paris 40 years ago. Parisians inhabit their public gardens and streets as though they were salons and corridors, and their cafes face the street and overflow into it, as though the theater of passers-by was too interesting to neglect even for the duration of a drink. Nude bronze and marble women are everywhere out of doors, standing on pedestals and springing from walls, as though the city were both museum and boudoir, while victory arches and pillars punctuate the avenues like the yonis and lingams of a militant sexuality. Streets turn into courtyards. The largest buildings wrap around other courtyards that are actually parks. The national buildings are as long as avenues, and avenues are lined with trees and chairs just like the parks. Everything, houses, churches, bridges, walls, is the same warm gray, so the city seems like a single construction of inconceivable complexity, a sort of coral reef of high culture. All this makes Paris seem porous, as though private thought and public acts were not so separate here as elsewhere, with walkers flowing in and out of reveries and revolutions. More than any other city, it has entered the paintings and novels of those under its sway, so that the representation and reality reflect each other, like a pair of facing mirrors, and walking Paris is often described as reading, as though the city itself were a huge anthology of tales. It exerts a magnetic attraction over its citizens and its visitors, for it has always been the capital of refugees and exiles, as well as of France. And of course I know that's a complex subject here as well right now, but of course this is a book written just before the millennium. And I wanted to read a little bit more. I wrote about uprisings and how much unarmed civilians really write the history of the world at so many times, as we saw in 1989, as we saw in 1789, as we may see soon in my country, as we saw in the Philippines in 1985, as we saw in the Arab Spring. Paris is the great city of walkers, and it is the great city of revolution. Those two facts are often written about as though they're unrelated, but they are vitally linked. Historian Eric Hobsbawm once speculated on, quote, the ideal city for riot, the print is very small in this light, and it looked like not, and I'm like, I did not write not. I wrote riot, I'm proud to say. The ideal city for riot and insurrection. It should, he concluded, be densely populated and not too large an area. Essentially, it should still be possible to traverse it on foot. In the ideal insurrectionary city, the authorities, the rich, the aristocracy, the government, or local administration, will therefore be as intermingled with the central concentration of the poor as possible. I'm not sure that's what cities are now, as the poor in cities around the world, London, Vancouver, San Francisco, New York, have been pushed to the periphery as they have here. But that was the ideal city of revolution. It was what Paris had been. All the cities of revolution are old-fashioned cities. Their stone and cement are soaked with meanings, with histories, with memories that make the city a theater in which every act echoes the past and makes a future, and power is still visible at the center of things. They are pedestrian cities whose inhabitants are confident in their movements, familiar with the crucial geography. Paris is all these things, and it's had major revolutions and insurrections in 1789, 1830, 1848, 1871, and 1968, and in recent times, myriad protests and strikes. And then I went on. I know the history of the revolution is often begun with July 14th and the storming of the Bastille. But for me, and all those of you who are actually French and had all this in your history lessons 1,000 times will forgive me for doing this in the Anglophone world. But on the morning of October 5th, 1789, a girl took a drum to the central markets of Les Halles. While in the insurrection of Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a woman compelled a local cleric to ring the church bells in his church. Drum and bells gathered a crowd. The woman, now numbering in the thousands, chose a hero of the Bastille to lead them, Stanislas Marie Maillard, who found himself constantly preaching moderation to his followers. Though made up mostly of poor working women, fishwives, market women, laundresses, porteresses, the crowd included some women of means and a few noted revolutionaries. And oh my God, I've never had to say Theron de Méricourt aloud to a French audience, known as Theron the Amazon. Prostitutes and men dressed as women loom large in contemporary accounts of the march, but this seems to have been because many believed respectable women were incapable of such insurrection. The women insisted on moving straight through the Tuileries, still the gardens of the king, and when a guard pulled his sword on one of the women in the lead, Maillard came to her defense. But, quote, she delivered such a blow with her broom to the crossed swords of the men that they were both disarmed. They continued on chanting, "Bread into Versailles." There's so many stories. There's a story about gender in that. Of course, the part of the French Revolution that fascinates me now as a climate activist is that it's the bad weather of 1848 that produced the bread failures, that produced the famines, that or in part produced the revolution that had many causes. But this unarmed revolution of the women that brought the king back and really got things rolling, I thought is such a fascinating part. And it was really out of this kind of community forming in the marketplace, and that decided spontaneously to head out for Versailles. And that power of civil society, I think, is where my hope lies in this moment in my own country and in other countries around the world. We need it. We have to count on it. It is the other superpower as powerful as governments. And when it comes together, when it comes to life, when it wakes up.
Just being reminded of the causes that factored into the revolution. Of course, a few months ago we marked 50 years since the uprisings of May '68 as well. It strikes me that one of the factors that makes sort of social movement, that turns a social movement into an effective insurrection, into an uprising, seems to be these moments where people from different backgrounds and militating for different causes seem to recognize that there is common cause between them. And it makes me think a little bit of some of the protests and some of the way things are operating in the United States as well. Would that seem like a fair comparison?
No, I think there is an amazing moment where what you have in common matters more than your differences, and you can set them aside, although petty squabbling is something the American left is very good at, and it does continue. But I think it's liberals' shining hour now. And there is a broad coalition from old school conservatives and middle of the road people to liberals and parts of the sort of feminist and non-white left, certainly, that I think has that common cause. But it is an interesting thing because some of it is rational and explainable, and some of it is something mysterious, that sense of people have of belonging to something bigger, of having power to write history with their feet in the streets, of often being so overwhelmed by indignation, grief, horror at what's happening that they no longer fear. And that pettiness that of both fear and kind of infighting is swept away. I've seen bits and pieces of this watched from afar in Mexico, in Eastern Europe, other places when these things have happened, seen, and it is remarkable and it is transformative. And it is a collective subjective experience that isn't entirely rational. So, and it seems to be happening around the torture of immigrant children that's happening, refugee children that's happening now, I think, and I'm hoping that's the beginning, and that people realize that we don't need to secure the future of 2,500 children. We need to do that by stopping the people who did this and who are also doing things to Muslims, to women, to people of color, to voting rights, to international relationships, to the rule of law and the Constitution in the United States, to the Paris Climate Treaty, which I was here for, which was such an amazing moment two and a half years ago.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's in the Men Explain Things to Me, if I remember rightly. You say that we need to find ways to appreciate advances we've made without embracing complacency, and that's a delicate task that we have to do, of enjoying the advances and celebrating them, but also not getting too comfortable. Do you think that's partly what was behind Trump being able to get to power, as this sort of a complacency on the part of people of liberal values?
And one thing that's interesting is how many people thought it was inevitable that Hillary Clinton would win. I spend a lot of time around doctors, and if somebody tells you have a 15% chance of getting cancer, you'd be terrified and immediately give up bacon and cigarettes. Well, maybe that last bit. And, but Clinton was said to have more or less an 85% chance of winning, but the 15% happens 15% of the time. But there was this sense of her inevitability, and young white men seemed to regard her as inevitable the way mom is inevitable. You can hate on her. I hear the sound of middle-aged women's solidarity, but this sense that it doesn't matter how much you hate on her, she's still going to be there, except that doesn't work that way with elections. But there's also, and I think in a larger sense, the world has forgotten the rise of fascism and what World War II was about in a way, to let it happen again. And it is funny seeing all these young men adulate the Nazis and in the US the Confederates, because they did both lose spectacularly and pathetically. But I think that there is a complacency that forgets about fascism, forgets about civil wars, forgets about pogroms and holocausts and genocide and other eras of intolerance. And that really Trump became president because so many people were asleep and disengaged and apathetic that it's really the triumph of distraction and apathy and non-participation. There was also about 20 million Americans lost their voting rights through Republican machinations to prevent mostly people of color and poor people from voting. Had those 20 million been able to vote, people often think, oh, you're a Clintonite, which I'm not really. But and you're saying Clinton would win, but really it means that if those 20 million had never been disenfranchised, the Republican Party could never, ever, ever win a national election, and the Democrats would be fielding far more progressive candidates. So, and there's so many things. Now, we haven't even talked about Vladimir Putin yet, but it was kind of a perfect storm. But complacency was a huge part of it.
There also seems to be that failure to acknowledge something else that you write about, where you say that women in politics, what is expected of women in politics is the bar is set much higher. So you say women must not be too feminine, since femininity is not associated with leadership, but they must not be too masculine, since masculinity is not their prerogative. And you say that being a woman, particularly in politics, is being in a perpetual state of wrongness. And I wonder,
sort of like being a woman on Earth in general. It's there's the wrongness of women who have children, and the wrongness of women who don't. The wrongness of women who are successful, and the wrongness of women who aren't. And there's a way you get to be found wrong, no matter what. And And that's really kind of what the title essay in The Mother of All Questions is about, is the way women are constantly questioned as to their choices, their right to exist, etc. And that the only way to really survive that is to refuse the questions, to define yourself in a way that doesn't, rather than let this sort of misogyny define you. But certainly we're having these ridiculous attacks on Nancy Pelosi again today, who is a far from perfect being, as is everyone else in American politics. And people are really, jump on this thoughtlessly, and it is a strange thing. But yeah, no, and of course gender was a huge part of what happened then, that election as well, on the left and the mainstream, not just the right. And I think a lot of people didn't realize how misogynist the culture still was. There was a sense, as with thinking that when Obama was president, that racism was somehow magically behind us, that misogyny was, and of course neither of those things are, and they're being grappled with as they are elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And will France ever have a woman president? When? Oh, right. Never mind. Not that one. Right. Yeah, and of course I also have to say, because we do get these awful conservative people where it's like, oh, you're supposed to support them, Condoleezza Rice or Marine Le Pen, because they're women, and and we're often told we're hypocrites if we're not supporting the Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May equivalent, and it's like, well, just as we had the hashtag not all men, not all women.
You obviously we've been sort of impressed by the level of the resistance and the level of the sort of the uprising against some of Trump's policies. But of course, in The Mother of All Questions, you write that you have this essay, An Insurrectionary Year, and you're talking about 2014, in fact. So there was sort of, it seemed already, so this was deep in or coming towards the end of the Obama era, there was already movement afoot there. Things already seemed to be being shifted. What do you think was at the root of that? What do you think that
of 2014 or?
Yeah.
And I think there's something really interesting with contemporary feminism. A lot of the boring stuff people didn't pay much attention to, more women TV producers or men who embraced feminism in these positions, in judgeships, in newspaper editorships, in a lot of positions of power. Something subtle had shifted bit by bit in the kind of incremental way no one pays attention to. So the way that sexual violence and sexual harassment were covered was really different than it had been before, and had often been trivialized, dismissed, or even treated as salacious. The victims were blamed, etc. And the full scope of the problem. And, I wrote about violence against women in Wanderlust. It's what prevents women from walking as freely as men in most parts of the world. And people would not connect the dots. You would have massive amounts of rape, harassment, etc. And people would treat each one as an individual case where it's like, well, gosh, oh, why did that happen? That's so surprising. And, and then it would happen again and again and again. And the statistics, were that these things were happening tens of thousands of times a year. It wasn't, they weren't anomalies, they were epidemics. And we finally were able to talk about that. I think it was the work of feminists, people like me who are identified as feminists, but I think that people in the mainstream, there are a great many feminists were now in the mainstream. Something slow and subtle had come out of the feminism that began anew in the 60s and was finally powerful enough to dictate how we would describe reality and what the consequences of violence against women would be. And that's, and so there's often a way people talk as though the Harvey Weinstein, Me Too, Time's Up moment was the beginning of something. And you can go back to 2014, which had an enormous shift, including revelations about people like Bill Cosby, a horrible radio announcer who was assaulting women at the Canadian Broadcasting Company, who was one of the country's most celebrated figures. We'd had other things I wrote in the Men Explain Things to Me about Dominique Strauss-Kahn, speaking of presidents you don't really want to have, and maybe, and so that there wasn't something entirely new, and Black Lives Matter too was in place. In the Obama era, Occupy Wall Street had brought a radical economic critique that's became international against capitalism itself. And so there really has been a great deal of radical engagement on a number of issues. We'd had the Dreamers and immigration rights movements that were also very powerful in the US. We've had a very powerful climate movement. So all this stuff was already there when Trump got elected. Although I should add, in all the explanations of Trump being president, I want to add something my friend L.A. Kaufman, a great feminist and journalist, said to me, which is we don't have to explain why Hillary Clinton lost, because she didn't. She did win the popular vote by a landslide. She did get more votes than any white man in the United States ever has. And there's a great many signs that the election was stolen, but nobody's done an adequate investigation. When Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, attempted to run an audit of those votes, the Republicans shut it down, clearly in a panic that we find out what really went on. So there's that factor too. But there is this interesting thing. People often want to tell simple narratives, and so much of my hope comes from just letting the full complexity exist, which is there is a percentage of the American population that's white supremacist, misogynist, wants to, their version of making America great again is making it 1958 again. When queer people were in the closet, women were in the kitchen, when white men ran everything everywhere in the country. But that's not, and people will often choose, just as our elections do, that one side is everything. But there's all these other movements. There's 50% of the young people under 18 are non-white. And, California, where we live, is a white minority state. And coming close to being a Latino majority state. So we're in a period of remarkable transformation. A lot of that, I think, is visionary, compassionate, and creative, and which is why we're also in a civil war.
You're obviously you've written a lot of books, but you've also adapted very well to sort of the new technologies as well. You've written a lot for online journals and magazines, and I'm just curious. You talked about the sort of the complexity of these stories and telling stories in a different way, and I also think about the this sort of this growing sense of insurrection building up to 2014. And how much do you credit sort of new technology and new ways of communicating for aiding this sense of insurrection?
I mean, we could also credit Facebook, Twitter, and every single thing the Russians did to intervene in the U.S. election was done through kind of internet technologies. There were many kinds of vulnerabilities to hacking, to trolling, to fake news, to all this kind of targeting people with the help of Facebook and etc. that didn't exist before. And I live in a city that I used to be very proud of. It's the birthplace of the Sierra Club and the land of Harvey Milk and gay rights movements and lots of lovely things. But it's now been kind of absorbed by Silicon Valley, which is an increasingly terrifying entity. I feel like just as Arab Spring organizers used Twitter very, very effectively, these things are tools that can be used in many ways, but that there's so many ways Silicon Valley has corrupted our attention spans, the nature of information. In the US, it's undermined the financial basis for good print journalism and newspapers, many of which have closed or reduced their staffs, meaning that although the major newspapers still exist, a lot of local news doesn't exist. And so I feel like overall, all that is terribly corrosive. And I've been around a while. I remember we organized before these things existed, and we communicated, but we also spent more time together. And Wanderlust, in a way, is a testament about what it means to be out in the open, whether you're communing with the non-human world, with the weather and other species in the wilderness or the mountains, or with your fellow human beings in a city. And so much of what the internet has done is encourage us to stay home and only connect through these kind of corporate mediated things. So I'm really suspicious of it, but I also think it's inevitable. It's like my hating it won't make it go away. So I use it and try to, aggrandize the good parts of it and critique the other parts. But it is really scary. And the word oligarchs is used for both the Russian billionaires and the Silicon Valley ones. And I see them sometimes as these two kind of cadres of authoritarian elitists, kind of enemies of democracy and the free flow of it, of information in some ways, or one by trying to profit off it, the other by trying to shut it, profit off it and manipulate the other by shutting it down. And I find it quite ominous, and it's one of the things that's quite ominous now. And played a huge role in Brexit and, a lot of the other scary things going on around the world.
So do you think the sort of the insurrectionary and political movements that have benefited from it have almost sort of slipped through the cracks? It was almost sort of an accidental effect of this slightly sort of terrifying.
I don't think it's exactly despite, and I think in a way the tools can be used, and it's impossible to say. It would be a different world if these things didn't exist. So you can't say what the Arab Spring or Occupy Wall Street, or hashtag feminism or Black Lives Matter would be without these things. So, but I think that it behooves us all to be deeply suspicious of them. And part of it is that they're deeply capitalism. I often think, what if search engines like Google, which Europe has been very smart in regarding as a kind of invasive monopoly of information control, technology, what if search engines had been created as public goods? What if social media had been regarded as a public commons? A lot of why Google and Facebook are gathering all your personal data is to sell to advertisers, because the business model is advertising-driven capitalism. What if all these things had appeared with a different model? I think, what if enough countries, some EU-like phenomenon, banded together to create other models? I think we really need something that isn't driven by advertising. And it is a sinister thing. I used to think, when I feel so much like I was so naive not very many years ago, that the worst case scenario would be that some government would hijack all the information. And I was much more alarmed by Google in those days than by Facebook. Although Facebook has turned out to be worse, at least in, the Trump election and short run, that in a sense that we'd have to have some sort of Stasi, Kremlin weaponization of that information. But, essentially they sell all your data for advertisers to target you. And there isn't really any difference between advertising a soft drink and a political campaign in terms of, we know what you like, we know what appeals to you, we know how to get inside your head and your interest group and your thinking. So
a moment ago, when you were talking about Wanderlust, you said it's sort of it was a celebration of sort of being out in the open, and that seems to me to be sort of a thread that runs through your work. Whether that's a sort of being out physically in the open, like being in the streets, in the countryside, but being able to sort of breathe as your personality, to be able to not have to hide, to not have to disappear, as you say, that historically it's been expected of women, or has been forced upon women, this sort of disappearance from the culture. And it makes me think of your essay on Pandora's box, and that's for me in a way it's sort of a source of hope despite the darkness, is that once these ideas are in the open, there's a sense that they're never going back in.
Yeah, I do believe that once you decide that abortion should be a woman's right, that it's completely normal to be attracted to people of the same gender as you, as normal to be attracted to various other genders. That, it's hard to make ideas go away. And that's one of the ways in which revolutions succeed. And it's funny, there's a kind of short-sightedness that will say the French Revolution didn't succeed, except that France never went back to absolute monarchy. And there's a wonderful thing my friend David Graeber likes to say, which is that the Russian Revolution was very successful, just not in Russia. Mm-hmm. And where he says that, Western European countries and North American countries were so terrified of a Russian Revolution, they made a lot of economic democracy, kind of, social welfare programs that made the lives of, hundreds of billions of people immeasurably better. But yeah, it's, where else were we going with that? I'm just trying to think of the other piece of it, the women and being out in public. And it's interesting because we're surrounded by novels here. There's a way, I feel like a lot of my work has been about what I call public loves, love of place, love of whether it's a city or a landscape or the earth itself, about these other things that sustain us, that matter to us, that we need to be committed to. Because there's a way that fiction in particular, but kind of a bourgeois privatization that's taken place that the novel's been part of, and that kind of neoliberalism put on methamphetamine has encouraged us to believe that all our joys and needs are private and personal. But I think we need to be citizens. We need to have a larger sense of belonging and a broader sense of connection. And it's not that I don't value the personal and private in my own life or anyone's, but that I feel they're adequately celebrated. So these other things I feel like have been neglected to some extent, and it's been exciting for me to be able to write about them, whether it's about political insurrection or actual cities and natural places and what it means to wander in them.
And there also seems to be the sort of the underlying idea that sort of that the liberation is not a zero-sum game, and this is sort of, it seems often to be couched in this in arguments, sort of more freedom for one person means less freedom for somebody else. But in fact, one of the things I think your work sort of articulates and also celebrates is this idea that sort of, the feminism, it's not just arguing for the liberation of women, it's arguing for the liberation of humanity, in fact, because men are restrained by the expectations of masculinity as well.
And one of the things that actually has been really beautiful and hopeful the last several years is more and more men actively engaging with feminism, both in terms of what it has to offer men, but also standing up against gender violence and harassment, and misrepresentation, and non-representation, men standing up saying, like, why are there no, I'm not going to be on this panel, no women are on, why are you not hiring any women, why are you not listening to the women at the meeting, etc. So yeah, there's constantly this idea, scarcity economics is the essence of capitalism. There's not enough to go around, so I need to steal yours to have enough for me. Sorry. And and there is another. And of course, and by that I mean not just the capitalism of the marketplace, but all the capitalism of personal dynamics and social interactions, is sense that there's not enough. And I think that there's an entirely different way of operating from a sense of abundance that, but also that these things are contagious. And one of the essays that will be in my anthology out in September talks about how Gandhi, as he was organizing his very first political campaigns in South Africa, before he'd returned to India, came to London, saw the women suffragists doing extraordinary things to demand their right to vote, striking in Parliament, etc. He was deeply influenced by them. And then he went off and created the Satyagraha kind of nonviolent campaigns that deeply influenced Martin Luther King. So then that came into the civil rights movement in the United States, which was deeply influential back in another South Africa, the South Africa of Nelson Mandela, and rights movements around the world. One of the things that set off the Arab Spring was a wonderful comic book, a kind of graphic novel about how civil disobedience worked that had been translated into Arabic and distributed. And I love those. And so much of my hopefulness is about telling these indirect consequences and long time frame stories. And so you can see this chain that goes, like the suffragists did eventually get the vote, but they did this other thing that it influenced Gandhi, who influenced King, who influenced. So you see these, like the Russian Revolution succeeding everywhere else, these indirect influences that matter so much. I often think people want to tell a history where it's like, either 2 + 2 = 4, or you never get to 4. These very simple thing. And so often the way that it works is something's introduced into the world. And one of my great heroes is Henry David Thoreau. And Civil Disobedience, his great essay, was much more influential, 100 years after he died than it was when he was alive. And so you see these indirect consequences and these ways we benefit each other, and that liberation benefits each other. And I'm a San Franciscan, and I haven't yet had time to write it, but I'm going to write an essay as soon as I have a window called Thank You, Gay Men. And because I grew up in San Francisco surrounded by gay culture, and it modeled for me that since men didn't have to be what masculinity demanded, that I as a woman didn't have to be what femininity demanded. It modeled other kinds of family that meant that getting married and having children wasn't the only way to have a close-knit and loving and reliable circle of people around you. And it taught me so many other things too, about style and sensibility and wit and insight, and so there's a way often that, for example, gay men's liberation would assume to benefit other gay men's liberation, but it greatly benefited me as a straight woman. And I think all liberation is like that, if it's really liberation. It has these kind of pervasive ricochet and modeling effects for others. So thank you, because that's one of the hopeful things to talk about. And these movements are going on despite Trump.
I think that I'm conscious there will probably be quite a few questions from the audience, but since you brought up Thoreau, I will just ask you something which really piqued my interest. Was you at a moment you talk about your personal pantheon, and you just mentioned Thoreau as one of them. You also mentioned, of course, Virginia Woolf, who you've written on quite extensively. But some of the other names, so George Orwell and Borges, you mentioned, it just seemed to me an incredibly diverse, from a point of view of style, particularly sort of a panel of writers. And I was just curious, obviously, since we are in a bookstore, I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the sort of the literary influence of this pantheon, or perhaps other writers too.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work that's mattered for me most, it feels like it opens up the world and says, you can do this, you can connect these things, you can think that way. And it is, I have kind of like a Pantheon shelf, and it has Pablo Neruda on it and Philip Levine, my favorite American poet, even though I don't write poetry, but the freedom poets take to connect by intuit and navigate by intuition has been really more important to my writing. Subcomandante Marcos, who I always thought should have gotten the Nobel Prize for Literature, the Zapatista voice, was really important for me, particularly when the Zapatistas rose up and kind of liberated their zone of Mexico in 1994 and after, for forming a kind of poetic, playful, lyrical, political discourse that was so alive and grounded in kind of indigenous mythologies and a deep connection to the real world, the world of flowers and insects and weather and skies and celestial bodies. That's so different than reading, Marx and Engels or something. So Virginia Woolf, of course, James Baldwin, as a great American prose stylist as well as a great liberationist. And, those have been some of them. And
thank you. Now I could go on, but I, as I say, I'm conscious there will be some questions. So if you have a question for Rebecca Solnit, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Please try and keep your questions brief so that we can get through as many as possible. And also, I know it can sometimes be difficult to be the first one, so don't be shy. Where shall we begin? Oh, there's one right at the back there. We'll just get the... Yeah, no, it's you, don't worry.
Hello. So you've written wonderful books in praise of creative reverie and wandering. And now as we're living through an age where technology is really, as you discussed, changing our experience of time and how we communicate with our imaginations, I was wondering if you could just, as you consider the future, discuss what we can be doing to improve our education system and the importance, this is a bit of a long question, and the importance of literature and the humanities in the digital age.
Thank you. And I don't have specific education reform ideas, but I do think there was a wonderful form of workers' strike, which was not to leave the factory altogether, but to do a slowdown to work half as fast. And this part of the ideology of Silicon Valley, of capitalism generally, is efficiency, convenience, cheapness, etc. And I feel that reading and books themselves enmeshes us in a sense of deep time, deep memory, as opposed to the kind of somebody once described the internet early on to me. I know we have Wikipedia and you can read about the 17th century and et cetera if you want, but still describe the internet as a way of forgetting everything before 1996. And there is that immediacy of kind of what did my friends post in the last 3 minutes kind of stuff. So I feel that reading and storytelling and intergenerational activity, the passing on of stories, the preserving of memory also in public monuments and signs and names and knowing those stories are really kind of acts of resistance to the amnesia that's also part of what makes, I think, people really manipulable. And, that we should do them because they're joys and they make our lives meaningful. But I also think that joy and meaning are acts of resistance to the kind of nihilism of the authoritarianism, totalitarianism we're faced with, which is also about everything means what I say it means. There's a wonderful passage by Orwell, who I've been reading a lot lately for obvious reasons, where he talks about how totalitarianism not only demands that you believe what they tell you, but they change it all the time. And you see this with Trump. He says something and then he insists he never said it. With the immigration thing, he insists that it was a democratic rule that made them separate the children and that he could do nothing about. And then he just, made a presidential order canceling the separation, proving that he'd lied the day before and not being held accountable for it. And so memory was, particularly in totalitarian regimes, and we know the Soviet one where people got erased from photographs and Trotsky got written out and the original intents of the revolution got written out as, the Animal Farm story Orwell tells, that memory itself is such a form of resistance. And it's part of, I think, the wonderful work that writers do, but writers are nobody unless there are readers. And, that process of keeping it going. I went to school here and I had a wonderful professor, Mark Pellin, who died last year, who used to say, they take literature very seriously in the Soviet Union, that's why they ban it. And there was a real sense there that literature mattered because it really could preserve these memories, provoke insurrection, reveal lies, etc. And literature, I think, for me, always includes journalism and good journalism. And it's worth remembering that, that power, and that often people think that political engagement is some miserable duty like flossing that we should do. But I think so much of it actually is pleasure, the pleasure of connecting to each other, to history, to the deep past, to our own possibilities, to our hopes, and to our courage. So thank you.
Any more questions? Don't be shy. Yeah, it's later. We'll just run the microphone to you.
I haven't read Wanderlust, but I see a lot of connections, I think, with just what you've been saying with the work of Walter Benjamin, who was obviously also living at a moment that was, in some ways, very similar to the moment that we are in now. And he, of course, talks about this disconnect from our historical past. And I wonder if you see some similarities between the disconnect that we're currently having, especially because of this relationship that we now have with the internet and sort of shock culture between this time and the period that he was writing in.
Yeah, I should have mentioned Benjamin, who's one of the presiding spirits of Wanderlust. When I mentioned kind of the pantheon, I can now picture where exactly all his books are on the bookshelf by my visual memory. Yeah, and I think, he's such a wonderful subversive figure because some of his work feels so creative, but gets treated as though it's purely academic scholarship when it's really something else. Particularly the theses on history, but I think all the stuff he said about flaneurs was highly inventive and not particularly historically reliable. But I think that his affirmation of the importance of just deep knowledge, deep thought, deep attention, deep presence, and the value of books, the value of living this kind of musing, dreaming life is amazing. And one of the things I've done when I'm in this part of the world is I walked his route from France to Spain some years back. And it was amazing to find out. It's sort of an addendum to Wanderlust that was published in the LA Times and then an anthology. It was an upside down question mark, like a Spanish question mark. But yeah, absolutely, his voice as well. And, and also as a voice of resistance. And he wasn't often that direct about the Nazis, except that everything he did was against their stupidity, their hypergeneralization. There's a way that racism depends on simple airtight categories and stereotypes and generalizations. And that's another work I think we do in the atmosphere of the library, the bookshop, of reading and writing, is to understand how leaky categories are, how many caveats there are, how complex it is, how many exceptions there are to every rule, how you can't say all blacks, all Muslims, all immigrants, all women, because, and how much, these evil populisms depend on that simplicity. So that I think complexity itself is also a kind of resistance. And that goes back to the education question, trying to preserve our capacity for complexity is a huge part of resistance. And it also lets us see each other genuinely rather than like, oh, you're a Muslim, I assume I know all about you. Oh, you're gay, I have all my stereotypes between us. Other questions?
Yeah. Okay, we'll go to the back first and then we'll come round.
So thank you for being here, of course. And something that, in particular, in Men Explain Things to Me and a lot of the works that you've had published in magazines on feminism and on politics in general, something you do incredibly well is write to a dual audience. So, for example, with your feminist literature, you're rhetorically effective in reaching women, but also in reaching your male audience. And I've found in this cultural moment it's incredibly difficult to have these conversations with men, especially in sort of the wake of Me Too, because I think a lot of them are afraid of the conversation, and especially like in a household with a single father parent and a brother who's almost 18, these conversations are really difficult but really necessary. And I was wondering if you had any advice for the women and non-binary people who want to be having these conversations with men but are having a difficult time reaching them. So
it is tough, and sometimes I think, and there's a joke about how many psychiatrists it takes to change a light bulb, and the punchline is that the light bulb has to want to change. And it's interesting because I think it is important, and I realized that until recently, my whole life, I'd been given the impression that feminism was women's work, kind of like, raising children and housework used to be, and that we could no more eradicate misogyny as women than people of color could eradicate racism without the participation of white people. And a lot of it is, I think, talking to them that this, like, where do you feel unliberated and what's expected of men and what is your liberation too? But also, and it is interesting because it does require, men have had power over women, and this does require for them to give up a kind of domination. But there is something, and Thoreau's written about this with slavery and James Baldwin with racism. There is a way where I think subjugating other people is soul destroying. And it would be really interesting if men would write in some, because we don't have a lot of men. We have them participating in the informal conversations, but we don't have a lot of men writing about what is it like to realize that you're not going to, what is it like being equal, what is it like? And it's interesting because some of it is built into a system where it takes two incomes to support a lot of households, where it's as expected that women will go to college and work and support themselves as men. But these other personal forms of domination, because we do have these horrible things where women are now saddled with great financial responsibility but don't have more dignity, safety, and freedom in some things. So yeah, it's it's also interesting because it's sort of, how do you it's often done. There's a really annoying thing that would happen during the Me Too stuff where men would be, I have a daughter, sister, whatever. And it's kind of like, can you just care about liberation because, raping people is bad? And, and men get raped too. So, but it is interesting kind of, and I think part of it is that we have framed it, feminism as women's work, and that we need to not do that. And I think that there needs to be, and there's these horrible backlash incel men's rights movements that are essentially about dehumanizing and hating and blaming women. But we don't have enough voices in the opposite direction of, I think, there were some fun things in the 70s. There was a little protest I'll always remember of these kind of hippie dudes holding signs that said, men are more than just success objects. It was really endearing. But I think it's a big question, and I think in a way it's for men to answer, which is what does their liberation look like, and how is it not separate from ours? Because I do think we get, we're free together or we're not. So, but thank you. It's an important question.
There was a question just there. We'll just get the microphone to you because there's lots of people outside.
Thanks for being here. I grew up with an operative phrase, comes the revolution. And I sort of believed that for a really long time. And at this point, I'm less sure than ever. And so my question to you says, what is the difference between resistance and revolution?
And the phrase resistance has become such a, like in my little button here, has become such a standard term, although I sometimes think opposition would be a better phrase for what we're doing in the US, because it entails partly being the opposite of what they are. And I've been talking about kind of cultural resistance, if deep memory is the opposite of forgetting, as well as resistance to forgetting. But revolution, because I'm old enough, I grew up with, and people used to say after the revolution, and by my time they were half joking, but they weren't entirely joking. And there really was this vision that comes out of the kind of Marxist-Leninist narrative that we would have a revolution in the governing political system, and somehow that would produce top to bottom liberation in all forms. And it didn't really address that you can have plenty of sexism and racism under communism, that you can have, and homophobia and, and the rest. But it also didn't address that incremental revolution, I think, is, and a lot of revolutions, some of them succeed in what they're doing, and, it's no longer a monarchy, it's no longer a dictatorship, etc. But there's so many kinds of revolution. I feel like my entire lifetime has been revolutionary, and that's again about the long view. You don't see how successful it is unless you take the long view, and it's easy in Trump's America to think that the fate of women is worse than it was last year, but I am the same age as the Berlin Wall, only unlike the Berlin Wall I moisturize, and so I'm still standing, and if I give you any other advice, but seriously. But the world I was born into, my mother's life was bleak in that, marriage was only heterosexual marriage, and women essentially regarded as property by the law. Husbands could rape their wives, punish them. Wives could not get checking accounts, take out loans, do lots of things without their husbands. It was quite normal for husbands to make huge life decisions about the disposal of property. My mother had a friend who told his wife, and they had small children, she couldn't walk away, that he'd accepted a job on the other side of the country and she was now going to lead a completely different life in a completely different place, and she wasn't much better than a slave in terms of her inability to determine. I don't think a lot of men would even conceive of doing that now. So women didn't have reproductive rights. I think sometimes when you went to get birth control, you were you needed your husband's permission. You were supposed to be married, and women would have to fudge about that. So to be gay or lesbian, and I'm just talking about the US, but I know it was similar here, was to be considered criminal or mentally ill and liable to be punished as one or the other. We had de facto legal segregation. Workplace sexual harassment was not a concept. Rape was considered only rape if you were a pure woman who had been assaulted by a stranger and had properly resisted. There was no work, we didn't recognize acquaintance rape, date rape, let alone marital rape, which was really only outlawed in the states, in all 50 states by, in the early 1990s. So when we didn't have a language for an environmental movement, we really were at the height when I was born of the idea of better living through chemistry. Artifice was kind of loved for its own sake. Pesticides were awesome. It was Rachel Carson who, on the English-speaking world, would really deliver the news on pesticides with Silent Spring, speaking of books that changed the world. So and you can see in the 1968 revolutions here and around the world, the rebellion also against the strictures of conventionality and conformity in broader ways. And what would a family be? How were we going to live our lives? What did we value? What kind of voices did students have in their education? What constituted a meaningful education? So I feel like I've lived a life of continuous revolution, where we've kind of changed everything but the regimes, but we've changed so many laws within the French Republic, the United States, and these other places that, if you brought somebody from 1961 here, they would, and told them how different some of these things are, same-sex marriage, for example, and some of the really good new inventions. The fact that fossil fuels, which were seen to be inevitable and immutable, what we would always do, that fossil fuels will become obsolete, in the lifetime of some of you here. They're essentially obsolete already, but getting rid of the corporations, defending them is a big part of the job climate work does. And even the revolution in, those technologies. In 2000, we did not have solar and wind that were adequate to replace fossil fuel power plants. There's been a technological revolution no one notices that's made that possible. So I feel like there's been not one revolution, but 1,000 revolutions, and that are really exciting. And that overall, another essay I have not yet written and would love to at some point is called "We Are All Anarchists Now," that there's also levels of authoritarianism in education and parent-child relationships in marriage, in bosses and subordinates, whether it's the military or the workplace, etc., that we don't accept anymore. We're so much more anti-authoritarian, which is one of the gifts of the 60s. I've heard people kind of say the 60s failed, but it's like the way the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution failed. Like nothing would ever be the same since. So I feel like we're well into a revolutionary project that should, need not ever end. Because I think future generations will see ways that we ourselves are blind and repressive and unliberated that none of us, or maybe some of the young people here, but I don't see at this moment.
I think that's a perfect moment to finish the event. Well, to finish at least the formal conversational part of the event. Please do stick around. Please have a glass of wine with us. Of course, we have plenty of Rebecca Solnit's books available at the till. I think more or less the entire backlist is available there. So go wild. And please just join me one more time in saying a big, big thank you to Rebecca Solnit. This has been the Shakespeare & Company Readings Podcast, with me, Adam Biles, production by David Grove, and music by the brilliant Alex Fryman, whose new album, Play It Gentle, is available now from our website, www.shakespeareandcompany.com. Thanks for listening, and see you again soon.